The Russian elections are over and Putin won. It's not surprising because the results are rigged. So there wasn't actually an election, I guess, but rather something that we can call a kind of legitimation ritual, because that is the purpose of that thing that they did in Russia this week. It is to legitimize Putin's power. But even though the results were not surprising, I still think there are some interesting aspects about it, and I just want to share some quick thoughts. So let's talk about it. When we talk about the Russian election, I think it's important that we keep in mind why it is that they have elections, because everyone knows that the election is rigged and everyone knows that Putin will win. But the point is that it legitimizes his power. Vlad Vexler has put out a very good video about that on his channel. I want to recommend that. But the point is that this ritual shows that the people is with Putin. It shows the elite that the people is with Putin. It shows the military that the people is with Putin. It shows to the Russian population that the people is with Putin, and it shows to the outside world that the people is with Putin. And if you're wondering how all this works, if everyone knows that the election is rigged, then I think it's quite obvious from the Western media coverage that it actually does work. Because at least here in Denmark, then again and again and again, we hear journalists saying things like, yes, the election is rigged, but a majority of the Russians actually do support Putin. So there is this underlying narrative that they manipulate the numbers a bit to make them look better, but they didn't actually have to do that because Putin would have won anyways. So this process of going through an election ritual, it gives legitimacy even in the West because it supports the narrative that the Russian people support Putin. And obviously it's BS because the most important way that they rig the election is that they make sure that there are no other good candidates there. Everyone else is nobodies or really unattractive. So the only serious candidate is Putin, but it still works because the journalists end up saying that a majority of Russians actually voted for Putin, even if the elections are rigged. So it creates that legitimacy, which is the purpose of the whole thing. All that's not new. But what is new is the extent to which this election is rigged. It was announced that Putin has won the election with 87% of the votes. In the West, many people assume that Putin always rigs the election so that he will get like 90% of the votes, but that's actually not the case. Usually they will have a lower number than that, so that will give the impression that there is a real competition going on. So if we take Putin's election results over time, then in the year 2000, he won with 53% of the votes. That was probably a pretty fair election. Putin's control with the system wasn't that big at the time. Then in 2004, he won with 72% of the votes. In 2008, Medvedev won the presidential election with 71% of the votes. I think it's fair to say that it was actually Putin running, but it was Medvedev's name on the ballot then. In 2012, Putin won with 64% of the votes, and in 2018, it was 77% of the votes. So in all these elections, there was actually quite a substantial number of percentage points that was given to the different opposition parties. And of course, these percentage points were divided by a number of different parties, so you wouldn't have any one candidate being even close to Putin, but it was recognized that in Russia there could be different opinions about politics and that a certain number of people supported someone else. For example, in 2018, the communist candidate got 12% of the votes. So in that sense, Russia did not have a totalitarian system because there was room for different views and the state did not dictate that everyone had to think the same way. They dictated who would win the election and who would get the political influence, but it was allowed that privately you could have different opinions. But this year, it's different. Now Putin took 87% of the votes, and that left only 13% for all the other three candidates. And the one of them who got the most votes was the communist candidate, who got just about 4%. In fact, they all got about 4%. It's of course not a coincidence. The Kremlin could have picked any number they wanted, but they made a conscious decision that Putin was to get almost everything and that all the others would get like an equally low, minuscule number. I think the message is pretty clear. Opposition is no longer tolerated. This is not new in the sense that we've seen this movement over the last couple of years, that Russia is moving in a more totalitarian direction, and this election is another demonstration of that. But I still think it's interesting to get these very tangible numbers on that development, because with this election, Russia is basically moving into full-blown banana republic territory here. It's like the model is no longer to pretend to be a Western-style democracy with a kind of pluralism, but to be like North Korea. And the reason they're doing this is that Putin is trying to change the social contract. Until now, he has very much built his power on a project of depoliticizing the Russian population. So it's the idea that you can do whatever you want as long as you don't get involved with politics. So if you want a good life, it's better not to have any political opinions at all. This is how the system has worked until now. But now suddenly he actually needs the population to be passionate about the political project that is going on, so they will be ready to suffer and willing to go to war, because his political project now is war. It's war against Ukraine, but it's also just perpetual war against the West. And he needs people to be ready to suffer for this project, because otherwise they will start protesting. So I made a whole video about this dilemma that Putin has, that on the one hand, he needs to politicize the Russian population in order to make his project more sustainable. But on the other hand, it's also dangerous to politicize them because it can get out of hand. And once you start going down that route, then they might also politicize against him instead of with him. So it can lead to more protests. And that's why we're seeing this gradual development toward a more totalitarian system, a system where opposition is no longer tolerated. And I think we can say at a more fundamental level, it also changes the purpose of the election. That the point is no longer just to provide legitimacy, but it's actually to show unanimity. It's not that a majority supports me, it's that everybody supports me. And that also means that it changes the message a bit. It used to be that the people is with Putin. That's what the election shows, and that's why he has legitimacy, so it's pointless to go up against him. That used to be the message. But now it actually is more that the people is Putin, and if you're against Putin, you're against the people. That's a very powerful message, and it's one that we are seeing more and more in the Russian society, that if people express an opposition opinion, they are being labeled as traitors or an enemy of the people or things like that. So this is the direction. And the purpose is to make the Russian society more robust so that they will be able to sustain a war over the coming years and decades. Okay, that was my quick comment on the Russian election. If you found the video helpful or informative, then give it a like. And also remember, you can subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to get notifications when I upload new videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.